President Biden said the midterm elections, quote, easily could be illegitimate. Is he predetermining that the November elections are going to be suspect?
Well, I talked to the president about this last night and this morning. He was not intending to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the 2020 election. He was actually attempting to make the opposite point, which is that in 2020, despite COVID, despite many attempts to suppress the vote, a record number of voters, Democrats and Republicans, independents too, turned out in the face of a pandemic, and election officials made sure they could vote and have those votes counted. He was also explaining that the results would be illegitimate if states do what the former president asked them to do in more than a half a dozen states in 2020, after the 2020 election, toss out ballots and overturn results after the fact. And his view is that one of the most important roles we can play now is informing and educating the public on what these laws are, on efforts to suppress their vote, and even beyond the laws, efforts in different states across the country to make it more difficult for them. Go ahead, Phil.
Thanks, Jen. Just to follow up on that, the president said, predicted that something would get done in the electoral reform side. Senator Manchin said today that he had spoken to the president about the bipartisan effort that's going on related to the Electoral Count Act as well. Is the president getting behind that effort? Are you guys involved in that effort? How do you see that effort playing out, given kind of when against that effort earlier through the context of the John Lewis Act?
Well, we've never been against it. We just have always wanted to be clear that it was not a substitute for voting rights legislation, which some, I think, were attempting to project. And so, especially as we were working to get the John Lewis Voting Rights Act across the finish line and the Freedom to Vote Act, which do very different things, right? I mean, than the Electoral Count Act. The Freedom to Vote Act creates standards for voter access and voter registration, outlines criteria to make redistricting less partisan, and strengthens campaign finance laws. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act establishes a new pre-clearance process to ensure that certain states and jurisdictions need approval from the Department of Justice before moving forward with changes that impact voting rights. The Electoral Count Act does something entirely different. So I think our point is it's not a replacement for it. But certainly the president is open to engaging with, talking with, as we are, even though it's not a substitute. Republicans and others who are interested in moving forward.
You said the president's intention was not to cast doubt on the upcoming midterms, but when a reporter followed up, the president said to him, "I'm not saying it's going to be legit. The increase in the prospect of being illegitimate is in direct proportion to us not being able to get these reforms passed." So yes or no, does the president believe, if all remains as it is right now, that the elections this fall will be legitimate?
Yes, but what the point he was making is that as recently as 2020, as we know, the former president was trying to work with local officials to overturn the vote count and not have ballots counted. And we have to be very eyes wide open about that and clear-eyed that that is the intention potentially of him and certainly of members of his party.
So to be clear, the president is satisfied, even if, because yesterday obviously voting rights hit a wall in Congress right now without the votes for the filibuster rules to be changed, and given the conversation you just had about other avenues that could be taken, if there are no changes in terms of voting rights legislation going forward, the president does still feel confident that the elections this fall will be legitimate?
Yes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jen. Just following up real quick on this legislative stuff. Yesterday, the president blamed Republicans for blocking his agenda, called them obstructionists, but he admitted that he hadn't reached out to any on the issue of voting rights. So now, given where things stand with these two bills, will he be reaching out to any Republicans, seeing that this bipartisan effort on the Electoral Count Act might end up being the only game in town on that?
Well, we don't accept that, but I will also say that there has been discussions between Democrats and Republicans for months now about voting rights legislation. They have been invited multiple times, a part of the conversation, reached out to, engaged with. 16 of them have supported the protection of voting rights legislation in the past and declined to do that this time. They are not uninformed about exactly what this legislation would do, and they've always been welcome to be a part of the conversation. They decided not to, and I think that's important for people to understand.